This is U.S. History. In case you forgot what class you were in, it's Chapter 24, The Shattered Society, 1963 to 1973. Hopefully, you were able to turn in your Week 6 packet, which included all the material for Chapter 23, and you got your Week 7 packet, which included taking your Chapter 23 test. Today technically should be identified as Tuesday, so hopefully you got all that figured out. Just a couple things that you guys need to know about the last 2 weeks of school now. I am not going to be giving you guys a quote-unquote normal exam like you are used to receiving. There's no reason to do that, in my opinion. So we're not going to be doing a normal exam. Instead, we'll just be taking the Chapter 24 test. That'll be your last grade of the semester of the school year. So sometime next week, you'll be taking the Chapter 24 test when we've finished all the notes. So don't worry about reviewing. Don't worry about picking up tests to have for the exam. All you're doing is taking the Chapter 24 test. If you have any questions, you can email me or contact me via Skype, and I'll try to help you out with. So let's get started into this. The very first thing about the Shattered Society, or what kind of kicked off the Shattered Society, was on November 22nd, 1963, on a very testable date, President Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. The picture on your left shows Kennedy in Dallas moments before his assassination. And then the picture on the right shows Lee Harvey Oswald, who 2 days later, in front of dozens of police officers, was shot himself and murdered by another individual. So you can see, of course, this definitely represents the Shattered Society. I want you to read page 553 and the first 4 paragraphs to yourself, kind of intro paragraphs for yourself, so you guys can see what things are looking like. Once you finish reading, please unpause the video and we will continue. My parents' first political memories were hearing about Kennedy's assassination. Your grandparents could tell you where they were when they first heard about it. Kennedy's assassination in their generation is equivalent to 9/11 happening in your parents' generation or in my generation. When news of Kennedy's assassination was announced, time seemed to stand still for many Americans. As the population continued to grow in the 1960s and 70s, chaos often ensued. Some of the contributing factors to this chaos include the post-war materialism that we talked about last chapter, movement to the suburbs, and increased mobility. These were all manifestations of the core value of growth. So let's talk about the new president, Lyndon Johnson, and the Great Society. The Great Society was the name of Johnson's domestic policy. And what you probably want to write down as well is, in it, the government would help all citizens gain the opportunity to better themselves politically, socially, and economically. As we go through this section, evaluate the success or failures of the Great Society. Letter A, building the Great Society. The first issue that's going to be brought up in the Great Society was civil rights. More and more Americans supported the legitimate demand for equal rights for all. For example, they included in these rights were improved educational opportunities for their children and the right to vote. Opponents often used violence against nonviolent protesters. For example, in 1964, the KKK brutally killed 3 civil rights workers who were trying to help blacks register to vote. In 1965, in Selma, Alabama, 3 white civil rights activists were killed in separate incidents. Angry white mobs or even policemen with tear gas and police dogs attacked peaceful protests. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the first law that we're going to talk about. It sought to guarantee the rights of black Americans. Please read on page 554, the pink box entitled The Civil Rights Act of 1964. Once you finish reading, please unpause the video and we will continue. Another law that was created was called the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It sent federal officials into states to help register blacks to vote and outlawed literacy tests for voters. Literacy tests were intended to make it so that people who couldn't read couldn't vote. That sounds fair, but what was unfair was the fact that many whites who couldn't read, they just kind of let it slide. They allowed them to vote anyways, while it was enforced only against black voters. The Voting Rights Act was the precursor for the 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment outlawed the use of poll taxes. Poll taxes had also been enforced on black voters, literally meaning that you had to pay taxes in order to vote. Or I should say you should pay a particular tax to vote. All of these laws were intended to help blacks acquire a greater political voice. Recognize that racism was a real problem during this time. For example, in one town, black parents who signed a petition asking that their children be allowed to attend a school for whites so that they could receive a better education were not sold food and were denied bank accounts. Also, one Alabama county required that existing voters testify to a person's character as part of the voter registration process. Because whites would rarely testify for blacks, and since black voters could only testify a set number of times, it was extremely difficult to register new black voters. Furthermore, some black people were beaten when they tried to register. Number 2, the War on Poverty. Thing you need to know about the War on Poverty was the name for the government's attack on poverty through job training and job placement programs. For example, Head Start, which was a preschool program for children from poor families, and Volunteers in Service to America, which was a domestic version of the Peace Corps in which thousands of enthusiastic young people volunteered to work in government programs helping the poor, were created during this time. The programs did succeed in raising thousands of people above the poverty level, although the general economic prosperity of the Johnson years might have had much to do with that success as well. Question might be asked, what should we do to help the poor and needy? That was a question that provoked intense debate. Many who opposed Johnson's war on poverty objected not to helping the poor, but to having the federal government do so through taxation. They preferred voluntary charity by individuals and charitable organizations. Scripture never excuses callousness toward the poor. In Deuteronomy 15:11, God tells the children of Israel, "For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee, saying, Thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to thy poor, and to thy needy in thy land." The Mosaic Law addressed poverty by 1, exhorting people to personally aid the poor, 2, requiring opportunities for the poor to work for their basic needs, such as gleaning laws, and 3, distributing the proceeds from a 10% tax, which was levied every 3 years to those in need. So the war on poverty. Let's pause for a second, and let me tell you a little bit more about President Lyndon Johnson. Who was he? Largely because of Johnson's years of work in Congress, he displayed extraordinary skills in his dealings with that body. Johnson became a congressional aide in 1931 and soon learned both how government works and how to work the government. He was elected to the House in 1937 and to the Senate in 1948. He became the Senate Democratic Whip in 1951. In that capacity, he learned the art of persuasion. His main responsibility was getting senators to vote for legislation endorsed by the Democratic leadership. He was elected Senate Minority Leader in 1953, and when the Democrats took control of the Senate in 1955, he became Majority Leader. In that position, Johnson mastered his powers of persuasion. He sought ways to build coalitions and pass compromises. He negotiated for hours and he granted favors to win votes. But he was sometimes ruthless and intimidating with those who opposed him. As president, Johnson initially had much success with Congress. However, as the Vietnam War dragged on, not even Johnson's considerable political skill could prevent a loss in both national popularity and legislative effectiveness. So let's talk about next, number 3, the election of 1964. Remember, Johnson became president because Kennedy was assassinated. And now in 1964, Johnson is going to run on his own merit. Already, it looked like the Democrats were going to win, and after Kennedy's assassination, Americans were even less likely to change leaders in under a year. It also helped that the Republicans nominated Senator Barry Goldwater. So LBJ on your left, Barry Goldwater on your right for the pictures. What was wrong with Goldwater? Well, Goldwater was an honest, unbending conservative who rejected the usual political practice of tailoring his message to please his audience. For example, he once denounced the Social Security system in front of senior citizens in Florida. He also suggested in Knoxville, Tennessee, that the government sell the Tennessee Valley Authority, 2 arguments that he would not win with those crowds. Black Americans opposed him because he voted against the Civil Rights Bill. He frightened more Americans by suggesting the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. For example, one of the campaign commercials that LBJ used actually was only used one time, but it was intended to scare Americans that Barry Goldwater would use nuclear weapons, and then therefore we would deal with nuclear reaction from the enemy. Other interesting things that took place in this election, a common Goldwater bumper sticker was AuH2O, the chemical symbol for gold and the formula for water, gold, water. Nice play on words. Regarding the Goldwater slogan, "In your heart you know he's right," Democrats responded, "Yeah, far right," or "In your guts you know he's nuts." So definitely a colorful campaign year. In the end, Johnson wins. He doesn't just win, he wins a landslide victory, as you can see from the picture screen there. Goldwater only won 6 states in the Deep South and his home state of Arizona. Number 4, a flood of legislation. With the Democratic President Johnson back in power, landslide victory, and Congress controlled by the Democrats, a whole bunch of different laws will be created during this time period. In the first session of Congress, Johnson used his victories and lopsided majorities to push no fewer than 89 bills, and we're going to talk about all of them today. Just kidding. We're going to mention the most important one, Medicare. This is what you need to know about it. It was the widest reaching program of this period. It is a government health insurance program to help elderly people pay for medical care. The federal government pays for this program by taxing the wages of all Americans. If you have a job, you get a paycheck and you get your pay stub. One of the things you'll notice is that you lose money to the government through taxes, Social Security, Medicaid, and you'll see Medicare. Yes, we still use Medicare today. Question might be asked, what's the difference between Medicare and Medicaid? Look at the pink box entitled 555. Entitled that on page 555 and read that pink box to yourself. Once you finish, please unpause the video and we will continue. That's all that we have time for today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Hope you have a good time. Be good, do good. Bye.